The rain fell in steady sheets, turning the quiet streets into glistening rivers under the dim glow of the streetlights. Ava's footsteps splashed through the puddles as she hurried home, clutching her umbrella against the wind. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart sinking as she saw him again, a tall figure in dark clothing, lingering at the edge of the sidewalk. It was the third time this week. Her pulse quickened as she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe he was just another commuter taking the same route. But deep down, she knew better. His pace mirrored hers, his steps closing the gap when she slowed and retreating when she quickened. As she turned the corner onto her street, the air felt heavier, the shadows darker. She quickened her pace, her apartment building finally in sight, its warm lights promising safety. But just as she reached the entrance, a sound froze her in place, a deliberate, echoing splash behind her. She didn't dare look back. Instead, she fumbled with her keys, her fingers trembling as she shoved them into the lock. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Closer. The door creaked open, and she darted inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind her. Pressing her back against the cool wood, she strained to hear through the thick silence. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Only the steady drumming of the rain against the windows. But as she let out a shaky breath, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. Her stomach dropped. Tentatively, she answered, the faint crackle of the line filling her ears. And then she heard it. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Ava's heart pounded as she whispered, "Who is this?" The line went dead. Ava's life had always been unremarkable, filled with routines that gave her comfort. By day, she worked as a graphic designer in a bustling office, and by evening, she returned to the familiarity of her modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a quiet neighborhood, safe, or so she had believed. The first time she noticed the man was during her usual walk home. It had been a long day, and the street was emptier than usual, the soft orange glow of the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. At first, she didn't think much of him. He wore a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the shadow of the brim, and walked a few paces behind her. She assumed he was just another pedestrian heading home. But the second time, it didn't feel like a coincidence. She had taken a different route after work, cutting through an alleyway to grab coffee from a small cafe before heading home. As she exited the shop, coffee in hand, she spotted him across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just scrolling through his phone, but something about his presence sent a shiver down her spine. By the third night, Ava's unease had turned into full-blown paranoia. She started altering her route home, taking detours through busier streets and stopping into crowded stores just to lose him. But no matter how unpredictable her path, he always seemed to reappear, silent, deliberate, and just far enough behind her to avoid confrontation. Her once peaceful neighborhood now felt oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in her own apartment. A creak in the hallway, the sound of footsteps from the unit above, everything seemed amplified, suspicious. The first truly unsettling moment came one night when she noticed her living room curtains slightly ajar. She always kept them closed. Always. Trying to dismiss it as her imagination, she reached for her phone, only to find an unknown number flashing on the screen. When she answered, there was no voice, no greeting, just heavy, rhythmic breathing. She hung up, her hands trembling, only for the phone to buzz again minutes later with the same number. By then, she knew this wasn't random. Someone was watching her, someone who wanted her to know they were there. And somehow, Ava felt this was only the beginning. Ava's days became a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound louder, and every passerby a potential threat. She started leaving work early, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a persistent edge of panic. The man in dark clothing wasn't just following her now, he was weaving his presence into her daily life. One evening, as she stepped out of the office, she saw him again. He was standing on the opposite side of the street, partially hidden by a line of parked cars. Ava froze, gripping her bag tightly. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even pretending to look inconspicuous. He was watching her. Deciding she wouldn't let fear control her, Ava ducked into a nearby bookstore, her pulse racing. She browsed the shelves aimlessly, sneaking glances out the window. At first, she couldn't see him. Relief started to creep in until she noticed his reflection in the glass, standing across the street, his hood pulled up, face obscured, still waiting. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just following her, he was toying with her. Determined not to go straight home, Ava took a winding path through the city, sticking to crowded areas. She darted into a grocery store, pretending to shop, before slipping out to a side exit. She even hopped on a random bus, riding it for several stops before getting off in an unfamiliar part of town. It seemed to work. By the time she reached her apartment, the streets were quiet, and she felt a sliver of relief. But the moment she stepped inside, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her breath hitched as she stared at the screen, dread pulling in her stomach. She didn't answer this time. Instead, she blocked the number and tossed her phone onto the couch. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were fragmented and filled with shadows. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart hammering, convinced she'd heard a knock at her door. She crept to the peephole, her palms clammy, but the hallway was empty. The next day, things escalated. Ava decided to speak to her building's security guard, an older man named Mr. Russo who always greeted her with a smile. When she explained the situation, his brow furrowed. "I've noticed someone hanging around here lately," he admitted. "I thought he was visiting someone, but he never comes inside. Just lingers out front." Ava's stomach churned. She asked Mr. Russo to keep an eye out and hurried to her apartment, locking the door behind her. As she set her bag down, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call, it was a text. "You can't hide forever." Her hands shook as she stared at the words, bile rising in her throat. She blocked the number, but the damage was done. Whoever this person was, they weren't going away. That evening, she spotted him again while walking her usual route home. This time, he was closer. Much closer. Ava's instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm, ducking into a narrow alleyway that cut through to another street. Her breath came in short gasps as she pressed herself against the cold brick wall, listening intently. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. He was following her. Without thinking, Ava bolted, her sneakers pounding against the pavement as she weaved through the labyrinth of alleys. She didn't stop until she burst out onto a busy street, the neon lights of a diner illuminating her path. She stumbled inside, her chest heaving, and slumped into a booth by the window. She scanned the street outside, half expecting to see him standing there. But there was no one. For the first time, she wondered if she was truly safe anywhere. The following days blurred into a haze of fear and paranoia. Ava found herself jumping at every sound, her life reduced to a relentless cycle of suspicion. She installed extra locks on her door, purchased a personal alarm, and even considered staying with a friend, but something inside her resisted the idea of running away. The breaking point came late one night when her phone buzzed on her nightstand. She groggily reached for it, expecting another spam notification, but froze when she saw the text. "Turn around." Her blood turned to ice. Ava's breath hitched as she sat up, scanning the dark room. Her curtains were drawn, her bedroom door locked. How could someone be watching her? She hesitated, every nerve in her body screaming at her to stay still. And then she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the window behind her. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ava grabbed her phone and crept toward the window, her heart pounding like a drum. With trembling fingers, she pulled back the curtain, and there he was. The man in the dark hoodie stood just beyond the glass, his face obscured in shadow. His hand was pressed against the window pane, the rhythmic tapping coming from his fingernails. For a moment, neither of them moved, their eyes locking through the thin barrier. And then he smiled. Ava stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat as she fumbled for her phone to call the police. As the dial tone rang in her ear, she heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating. By the time the operator answered, the man was gone. The police arrived quickly, combing the area around her apartment. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside her window. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But Ava knew better. Determined not to live in fear, she decided to take action. She installed security cameras around her apartment and changed her number, ensuring the man would have no way to contact her again. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks passed without any sign of him. Until one night, Ava was returning home after a late shift, her neighborhood unusually quiet. She felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes from convincing yourself the worst is behind you. As she reached her front door, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Miss me?" Her heart sank as she whipped around, scanning the street. The man was nowhere to be seen, but Ava felt his presence, like a shadow lingering just out of sight. She stormed into her apartment, slamming the door and locking every bolt. Her breathing was ragged, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. And then the landline rang. Ava stared at it, dread pulling in her stomach. Slowly, she picked up the receiver, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" The line crackled for a moment before she heard it, the same slow, deliberate breathing that had haunted her nights. But this time, there was something new. A voice. Low and chilling, it whispered two words that made her blood run cold. "I'm inside." Ava's scream echoed through the apartment as she dropped the phone, her fight-or-flight instincts kicking in. She grabbed the closest object she could, a heavy lamp, and backed into the corner of the room. The sound of creaking floorboards filled the silence. He was in the apartment. She didn't wait to find out where. Throwing open the door, she bolted into the hallway, her neighbors rushing out of their apartments at the commotion. Someone called the police as Ava collapsed into the arms of a kind elderly woman, sobbing uncontrollably. The police arrived moments later, searching her apartment from top to bottom. They found no one. But on her living room table, scrawled in shaky handwriting on a piece of paper, was a message. "See you soon." Ava moved out the next day, leaving behind the city she once called home. She never heard from the man again, but the fear lingered like a shadow, a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who blend in with the crowd. Months passed, and Ava slowly started to rebuild her life. She moved to a new city, far from the haunting memories of her stalker, and took every precaution to keep herself safe. She chose an apartment in a secure building, avoided routines that could make her predictable, and even enrolled in self-defense classes. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. But the fear never completely disappeared. Every unknown number on her phone, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, brought back flashes of the man in the dark hoodie. She would never forget the way his smile had chilled her to the bone or the sound of his breath on the other end of the line. One rainy evening, Ava was walking home from a nearby cafe, her umbrella shielding her from the downpour. The streets were quiet, illuminated only by the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. As she turned a corner, she felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart quickening. No one was there. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid, and quickened her pace. When she reached her apartment, she double-checked every lock and set the security alarm. Dropping her wet umbrella by the door, she turned on the TV to drown out the unsettling silence. As she settled onto the couch, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She hesitated before picking it up. It was a message from an unknown number. Her breath caught as she read the words. New city, same game. Ava's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the familiar dread washing over her. She bolted to the window, her eyes scanning the street below. And then she saw him. Standing beneath a street lamp, the man in the dark hoodie looked up at her window. His hood obscured his face, but Ava could feel his gaze boring into her. This time, though, she didn't freeze. She didn't let the fear consume her. Instead, she grabbed her phone and dialed the police, her voice steady and firm. The man lingered for a moment, as if daring her to act. But when the distant sound of sirens pierced the air, he disappeared into the shadows. Ava didn't sleep that night, but something inside her shifted. She realized she couldn't let this man control her life any longer. He might still be out there, lurking in the darkness, but Ava was determined not to be his victim. The next morning, she met with detectives and shared every detail, every clue she could remember. She refused to live in fear. As she walked out of the police station, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the city in a golden glow. Ava looked up, a sense of resolve washing over her. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew this. She wasn't the same woman who had cowered in her apartment, terrified of every shadow. Now, she was ready. As Ava moved forward with her life, she carried the lessons of her harrowing ordeal with her. She became an advocate for personal safety, sharing her story with others to help them recognize the signs of stalking and protect themselves. But her journey raises a question. How far would you go to protect yourself when faced with relentless fear? Would you take matters into your own hands, like Ava did, or seek help at the first sign of danger? Ava's experience is a chilling reminder that vigilance and courage can mean the difference between being a victim and taking back control. Her story leaves us with a thought-provoking message. How can we empower ourselves and others to stay safe in an unpredictable world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Ava's place? Do you think the steps she took were enough, or would you have handled things differently? Your insights could help someone out there who's facing a similar nightmare. The rain fell in